I've had the idea for this vid for a while, although it does frequently get suggested. Sumo games are an interesting genre after all, especially to us folk because 99% of sumo games are stuff that we've naturally never seen here in the West. It's doubly interesting to me because rather than this just being a subject of simple curiosity, I love sumo. Always have, ever since it used to be on Eurosport back in the 90s. I'm familiar with some of these games already as it happens, and we've got some real good ones here. From what little I've seen online, there's a preconception that sumo games are pretty simplistic button mashers and generally not that good. However, I'm here to say that actually, the best sumo games are a lot more complex than they might be given credit for, and provide a unique take on one-on-one fighting. So, with that in mind, here's a potted history of sumo games. We've got 10 of them. There's a few more than that, but these are the ones that I think best represent the sport's journey. And so, without any further ado, it's time to let out a hearty Hakkioi and get on with the slapping action. We begin with two arcade games, either one of which could basically be the first proper sumo game out there. Technos' Susei Izumo and Data East's Izumo the Grand Sumo, both released in 1984. They're both a bit different from each other, although they set out what we're largely going to see. Your credit gives you entry into a heavily cut down basho, which is the name for a sumo tournament. You have 3 matches instead of the usual 15, and you must win 2 of them to proceed to the next level. In both games you have the option to slap and grapple when you come together, and as with Japanese wrestling games, there's more to things than simple mashing. There is mashing, but in particular with Susei Izumo, you have to time an actual attack when the bar gets as close to the top as possible. That's kind of the key to victory. Technos' game is the one that looks a bit more like an arcade game. It's certainly a lot more exaggerated in presentation than Data East's title, which is considerably more grounded in reality. They're both pretty cool games. You're going to get at least 3 matches with each credit, which I think is pretty fair as far as arcade games go. Data East's game is a bit more simpler perhaps. In the main, button mashing is kind of the order of the day for both of these. For being the first sumo games, both are quite cool, although neither are as influential on this little subgenre than the game that we're going to see next. I'd still recommend having a quick look at them, mind you. We skip ahead a couple of years for the first major sumo game to hit consoles, and believe it or not, it's a total classic. It's basically the game that's going to inform just about every other game that we'll see, one of the kings of this genre. And you might have never even heard of it before today. Now you may well already know Tecmo from some pretty cool sports sims over the years. Tecmo Bowl, Tekken World Cup, Tecmo World Wrestling and so on. And well, here's another one by them. Tsupari Izumo, released in 1987, was, at the time, the definitive word in sumo games, and as such, it's a fantastic proper introduction into the world of actually playing these things. It's pretty simple options-wise. You either start a new career, continue one via a password, or battle with a friend. To start a career, you just input a name and away you go. Your journey begins in the lower Makuchi ranks, and you have to work your way up, through the Megashira numbers, to Komusubi, Sekiwake, Ozeki, and finally to the top rank of Yokozuna. You compete in a series of 15-match bashos, and your goal in each is to achieve Kachikoshi, a winning record of 8-7 or higher. Do so and you'll increase in rank. If you get a Make Koshi, a losing record, however, you may well drop in rank. As you win matches, your Rikishi gradually levels up, and you can also get bonuses if you beat wrestlers that are ranked higher than you. The best example of this is a Kinboshi, which you get if you're a Megashira and you defeat a Yokozuna. And if you do really well in a tournament, say 15-0 or 14-1, who knows, you may win it. This game may look quite intimidating, considering it's mostly in kanji, which very few people understand, and Lord knows I don't, I barely speak English. But really, it's simple enough to play. The controls are straightforward. After the ceremonial proceedings and the salt throwing ends, and the Goji, the referee, in this instance played by Tecmo's rabbit mascot, brings you together, you have a fair few options. Broadly speaking, B is used for slaps, or oshidashi, as well as initial grabs or even special throws. Another good stock technique is forward and A, which grabs opponents by the belt and tries to push them out. This is known as yoikiri. There are plenty of other moves, lifting opponents up by the belt, slapping them down, turning them around when you're on the edge. You get to grips with these quickly as generally they correspond to natural directions and buttons. The more moves you successfully execute, the more you sap the opponent's energy and the more momentum you obtain. When the bar flashes, it's possible to execute a special kimarete, or finishing move. In this example, I have chucked my fellow Rikishi many feet into the air, sending him down with a massive crash onto the doyo, and most probably killing him outright. Well, never mind. For this I will no doubt obtain a large reward of Kenshokin from the Goji at the bout's end. Bouts are usually pretty quick, although they can be filled with drama. Sometimes you get an easy opponent who you just quickly put away with forward and day or whatever. Sometimes you have a match that you just simply can't win yet because you're not skilled enough. Naturally, it's the matches against those closer to you in skill that end up being ding-dong, knockdown, drag-out fights that could go either way, and that's where the game really gets fun. It's not super complex, but it's simple enough to be very addictive. I ended up losing out in my first basho, but my Rikishi returned much stronger the next time out and was able to get a winning record comfortably. It's the sort of game that can happily occupy me for a decent chunk of time, and it's definitely one of the most important sumo titles out there, to the point where it's had several re-releases on everything from the PC Engine to the Virtual Console, as well as a sequel that we'll be seeing a little later on. If you want to get into sumo games, this perhaps is where you should start. There are a fair few other Famicom sumo games, most of which follow the template set by Sakura Izumo, but I'm just going to highlight one out of this lot. Chiyonafuji no Oicho, released by Face in 1990. The main reason why I highlight this one is because not many of these sumo titles are licensed games, mostly they're more generic than that. This is an exception, however, being that it highlights a specific Rikishi, no less a figure than the almighty Chiyonafuji, who dominated the sport throughout basically the whole of the 1980s. If any Yokozuna is worthy of a game named after him, yeah, this guy fits the bill. And the game itself is actually pretty okay. A bit simpler perhaps than Sakura Izumo, and the fights tend to resolve themselves a hell of a lot quicker. The fun exaggerated animations are still around, what with people crashing headfirst through the doyo and so on. And you can also happily watch the CPU wrestlers do their thing whenever you want, either in real time or fast forward. Or if you don't want to bother with that, you can just skip to your own fights. The main thing about this game, the main innovation, is that it brings a special meter to the table that you fill using the down button, and that you then use to perform moves. You have to constantly refill it. This is an innovation that we're going to see a lot of later on. It's not a bad game at all, although my personal preference is to Tecmo's game, as you can probably guess. Now, let's move on to the 16-bits. One curious thing is that, for the most part, sumo games seem to be Nintendo only, at least until PlayStation. For whatever reason, although more than likely due to the Big N's general dominance, there were very few on other platforms. The PC Engine only had one, and that was a sort of sequel to Sakura Izumo. The Mega Drive also only had one, and it's Haremanada, released by Sega themselves in 1993, and a fair bit different to the games we've seen so far. It's also another licensed game. This time, Haremanada is based off of a popular manga and anime. It's considerably more arcadey than other games we've seen, complete with a straight health bar as opposed to any attempt at momentum, and honestly, it's not very good. It certainly looks good, it's flashier than anything we've seen so far, and it's certainly better looks-wise than pretty much anything we're about to see on the SNES. It's a bit of a sluggish and unresponsive button basher in the play department, however, and the play is so shallow. The AI most of the time seems to fall if you just bash the slap button endlessly. Occasionally they may do something different like jump everywhere or counter a bit, but it's the sort of AI that then does only that instead of doing, a mix of things. There's also a few special moves too, although I can't say I felt the need to ever use them. Oh, and this game follows the plot of the anime to the letter. Haruo Manada, a new Yokozuna, declares that he's going to beat the old record of 69 straight unbeaten fights, and that he'll retire if he loses even once. This does indeed mean that you have to win 69 straight matches in this game, usually against the same set of, about a dozen or so Rikishi. Needless to say, the game gets terminally dull long before that point. The music's good, mind you. It actually sounds a hell of a lot like the music to Shinobi 3, meaning it's no surprise that Shinobi 3's sound team of Hirofumi Murasaki, Morihiko Akiyama and Masayuki Nagao also works on this game. On the whole though, for a sumo game and for a first-party Sega title, this is quite the disappointment. I feel that a lot of the misconception that sumo games are button mashers comes from this game, honestly. It's one of the more known sumo games out there, but it's bloody awful, especially compared to games we've already seen or are going to see. And indeed, on the SNES, sumo goes from strength to strength. We've got two awesome titles to look at here. The first is Tecmo's proper follow-up to their original NES classic, Tsupare Izumo Rishin Shuseihen. This is a pretty good sequel, even if it generally follows the same formula as the original. If you've played that, then you should already be very familiar with how this game works. And if you haven't, it's very easy to pick up and play. These are probably the sumo games that I would recommend most people to start with. It's still got that nice cartoony feel about it, and it's very addictive. Mainly because bouts just come and go so quickly, you can easily get through a basho or two with no time at all, while having plenty of fun. Upgrading your Rikishi isn't just a matter of eating bowls of natto either. There's now stats to play with, as well as specific upgrades through mini-games between each basho. It's a jolly fun sequel, although it now has a different and much more serious contender on the other side of the dojo. If I was to single out one game as showing how generally in-depth sumo games can be, then I would pick this one, Takara's Izumo Tamashi, or Izumo's Spirit. It's a very different game from what we've seen before, one that's tougher to get into. A proper simulation of sumo that, once you get to grips with it, becomes really satisfying to play. While the aim of the game is naturally the same as most others, create your Rikishi from one of the few bases that are on offer and then take them up the ranks, the fighting is very different. You may well look at it and wonder how on earth it works at all. So, let me explain. At the start of a bout, you'll notice the middle meter there is going Garrity. You want to press Y when it's as close to full as possible, as this will give you an advantage at the start. This meter is the same as the one in Chiyoda Fuji on the NES. You use it to perform moves, and you charge it up using Y. Now don't hold it down too much, because it does reset to 0 once it's full, but just enough so you've got a full bar to play with. Now I take this bar basically to represent controlled breathing. The other buttons correspond to various grabs, shoulder buttons are used for slaps, and everything's about timing. The top and bottom meters are for endurance and resistance respectively. Resistance does go up slowly when fighters are together, but endurance is a limited resource that goes down when moves are performed on you and when you perform moves. The lower that both of these meters are, the more chance you have of losing the fight. Basically, there's stamina in play here, so you don't want to go crazy performing moves willy-nilly. Another thing to mention is the hands below the meter. These come into play when you're grappling, and they represent the grip that you have on your opponent's belt. You use the A button to try and get a grip, and it's quite important to do so. Certain throws, which you can perform with X, can only be done with a one- or two-handed grip. Quite clearly there's a lot to think about with this game. As I said, it's hard to get used to managing these meters. Even with all of this in mind, you will lose a lot when you start playing. You may even lose every match in your first basho, but that doesn't result in a game over or anything. You just dust yourself off and move on to the next tournament. Eventually, you'll start to get to grips with the game's timing, and you'll start winning. And winning in this game is very satisfying. Izumo's Spirit, as you can see, has a much more realistic presentation than the other games that we've seen, which goes a long way to making it feel like the most earnest attempt at recreating the sport that we've seen so far. I would go as far as to call it the genre's equivalent to Fire Pro Wrestling. There's a moment, much like that game, where everything just seems to click and you just get it. If you're unfamiliar with this little genre, I wouldn't recommend that you go to this one first. Tecmo's games are much more friendlier, but this is definitely one to play because it's a brilliant little game. There is one more fantastic 2D sumo game to cover, mind you, one that very few people seem to know at all. I think I could find literally one video on YouTube for it, but it's awesome. It's on the PlayStation, and it's a part of the Simple 1500 series of budget titles. It's volume 58, and it's simply called Le Sumo. These Simple 1500 games can be variable in quality, but when they're good, they're well worth the price. And this sumo game turned out to be a highly addictive and very welcoming little bruiser. And once again, it's a game that destroys the misconception that sumo titles are just plain old button mashers. So, what do you do here? Well, you don't have to go into the full basho if you don't want to. You do have a more arcadey mode to play with, as well as a regular versus mode. The meters are a bit simple here, just momentum and resistance really. You can deliver some very satisfying slaps when the rikishis aren't together, and when they are, well, you'll notice the meter that goes up. You've got to press the button for your move when the meter's as close to the top as possible, sort of like Fire Pro again in that it's all about timing, do not mash. If you win that, the bar will flash on your side, at which point you perform your move with another button press, whether it be a throw, picking up by the belt, or just general pushing. Not as complex as Izumo's Spirit perhaps, but the excellent animation and the sound effects really do contribute to this one. There's other nice little touches, such as a painting of the finishing move once the bout's over, and like all the best sumo games, it's so fast paced. Before you know it, you've already played a whole bunch of bouts and you're looking to play even more. This is one of my favourite sumo games, and it's definitely one that you should seek out. Our final two games take the jump into 3D, as you might expect. We have one for the N64 first off that isn't quite as cool as most of what we've seen so far. It's 64 Izumo 2. Now the look of this 3D title is certainly a bit different to what we've seen. Very Japanese, very chibi I suppose, and let's face it, it's definitely an acquired taste. There seems to be a big cast of characters as well, and lots of talking, lots of cutscenes. It gets a bit annoying, especially when you're used to so many of the good sumo titles being so much more immediate. Seriously, it makes you impatient. Just get to the damn fighting already. Anyway, once you're in the bout, it's weird. Pretty simple on the whole. Basically everything attack and defense is done with the C buttons. The game even pretty much tells you what to press most of the time. If the opponent's trying to throw you one way, guess what? Press the opposing C button. Then do the same on him, and more often than not, he goes over. You can also use the C buttons for your regulation big doses of maximum slapation. What's quite odd is how slowly the rikishis move. It's odd in that a lot of the game seems to run at a full 60 FPS, which is kinda rare on the N64, but the actual wrestlers themselves are as slow as molasses. It's a trifle disconcerting. It doesn't seem to be some issue with how the game's running or anything, it just seems to be the way it is. And needless to say, I don't like it. There's just too much going against this game in the end. Too many problems that put it far, far behind most other games that we've seen. Well, except for our Harimanada. It's a hell of a lot better than that one. Seriously, don't play that shit game.
両力士もすでに体は真っ赤になっています。投げ技か。イドリ。イドリ。
And all too suddenly, we've come to our last game. It seems that much like Japanese wrestling games, sumo games had a pretty hard cut-off after the PS2 era. After then, it doesn't seem like anyone was really interested in spending the money to make any more of them. You get the odd casual game here and there that has a bit of sumo here and there, something like Sumotori Dreams for example, but that isn't really what we're covering in this video. And so, our final game, which is still one of the last proper sumo games to date, is Konami's Nihon Sumo Kyokai Kunin Nihon Izumo Gekito Hon Bashohen from 2002. You can just call this Japan Sumo Association's Tournament 2 if you want. Most of the games we've seen so far have been unofficial affairs, although as you might expect a lot of the wrestlers in those games have been similar in name and appearance to real-life sumos. Konami's game, on the other hand, is an official affair, featuring a lot of Rikishis who are active in the early 2000s, and I do believe a few legends as well. Annoyingly, the character list is kind of bare in the beginning. You have to unlock a lot of wrestlers, which I presume you do through facing and beating them in bashos. Still, there's the likes of Musashi Maru, Asashoryu, Takanahana. Some names that you may well know are here, so long as you watch the sport. Once again, we've got a whole new system to learn. Naturally, we've got the pre-fight preparations to go through first, the salting of the ring, the announcements, the sponsor boards. It's all here. It's an excellent presentation to be sure, although you're probably going to be skipping through it after a few bouts. Once you get into a fight, you'll find that most everything is done with the analog sticks. The left one, as you might expect, moves the wrestler. The right is used for moves in conjunction with pressing the analog stick. Yes, that much unloved button, R3, finally gets a chance to shine in this game. If you're not together, R3 and a direction will perform slaps and charges, and when you're grappling, they'll attempt throws. The face buttons are used purely to counter attacks. You'll see the command come up, and you've got to be quick to make a movement that corresponds to it. And there's also L2 and R2. You use these buttons to get a grip onto your opponent's belt, and once you've got it, you hold these buttons down for dear life. A good grip naturally results in a stronger attempt at a throw. Stamina is very much in play with this game, as you should expect. Sumo is a sport about being very explosive and decisive. You cannot just perform moves willy-nilly. Seriously, if you try and perform 2 or 3 moves in quick succession, just hammering buttons, your Rikishi will be completely shagged out and he will be thrown to the ground immediately. You've got to know when to sit back and defend, and when to attack. It's a balance, as obviously you can't just sit back forever. Once again, it's going to take a good few fights to get used to this game's system. You're certainly going to lose a lot of bouts in the beginning. And again, once you do get used to it, winning is very satisfying. It definitely feels like you've earned that victory, and you've earned that big ol' envelope full of yen. Having said all that, while this game is good, and certainly as good as 3D Sumo has ever gotten, sumo games just seem to feel more at home in 2D. They just work so much better there. Now it feels kind of odd to say that. Sumo is something that's gotten a little bit old-fashioned over time, as well as less commercially successful, which has surely contributed to the complete lack of sumo games over the past, nearly 20 years now. The genre didn't get much of a chance to evolve in 3D, is what I'm saying. But the 2D games are just so much more immediate and fast-paced, and in the end, that totally suits such a fast-paced sport. And with that, we're done. Now I really hope that this video, more than anything, has given you a bit of an education in the world of sumo games. It's a very niche genre indeed, but it's one that's produced a pretty decent hit rate. All but 2 of the games I've covered here are really good and totally worthy of your time, especially if you enjoy watching sumo, and heaven knows you should, or just if you're into fighting games, as sumo games are pretty bloody unique in their own way. Check some of these out for yourself and see what you think. Before you know it, you could be fighting for a place on top of the Banzuki, and that prize of a big old golden sea bream could be yours. Bye for now. Thanks for watching this video. Now if you like this video, please do comment on it. Perhaps you've got some awesome sumo games that you like yourself. Be sure to have a look at my social media, particularly my Twitter, and if you like my stuff, you want to support it, you want to see exclusive stuff such as wrestling videos for example, have a look at my Patreon. You could join this list of awesome people right here. Alexa Jones Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Andy Cat, Arcade LY Webmaster, Asobi Kwan DX, Brian Henniger, Chris, Conrad Pritchard, D. Zalior, Rimron Sutter, Dave Cook, David Rose, Dinty76538, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Geordie Alex, Glunnatheth, Jay is Manchild, James Brown, Jason Stevens, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Lucas Kuligovsky, Matthias Granzov, Martin Pataki, Nate Milbank, Potter Margel, Renby Mon, Rusty Kelly, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tariq Amir, Tim Wald, Yerka Operator, and to all the rest of the community, all my wonderful, wonderful fans and supporters, thank you so much and goodbye.